In the darkening waters off the coast of Sicily, ancient Greek sailors whispered warnings to one another as shadows moved across the volcanic cliffs. Stories of one-eyed giants who hurled boulders at passing ships had traveled from crew to crew for generations, passed down in hushed tones during long nights at sea. But what most people don't realize is that these weren't just stories designed to frighten children or entertain around campfires. These were sworn testimonies from men who staked their reputations, their livelihoods, and sometimes their very lives on what they claimed to have seen with their own eyes. The Mediterranean world of ancient Greece was a place where the line between exploration and survival blurred with every voyage. Sailors ventured into uncharted waters, not for glory or curiosity alone, but because trade demanded it, because colonies needed establishing, because the known world ended just beyond the horizon, and someone had to be brave enough or desperate enough to see what lay past it. These weren't casual travelers. They were hardened seamen who understood currents and stars, who could read weather in the color of the sky and knew the difference between a seal surfacing and something that shouldn't exist. When these men returned to port, speaking of giants with single eyes in the centers of their foreheads, their communities listened. But the question that haunts us across the centuries isn't whether they were lying. It's what they actually saw. Homer's Odyssey, written sometime around the 8th century before the Common Era, contains one of the most vivid descriptions of a Cyclops encounter ever recorded. The scene where Odysseus and his men become trapped in the cave of Polyphemus has captivated readers for nearly 3,000 years. However, scholars have long debated whether Homer was simply crafting an entertaining tale or recording something far more interesting. The detail in his description goes beyond what you'd expect from pure fiction. He describes the Cyclops as a shepherd, living in a cave with his flocks, making cheese, following a daily routine. These aren't the actions of a mindless monster. They're the behaviors of an intelligent being going about his life until strangers arrived uninvited. What makes the account even more intriguing is how it differs from typical monster stories of the ancient world. Most mythological creatures in Greek literature existed to teach moral lessons or explain natural phenomena. The Cyclops in the Odyssey doesn't fit that pattern as neatly. Polyphemus isn't guarding a sacred treasure or blocking a symbolic passage. He's literally just a shepherd who finds intruders in his home and reacts with violence. The practical, almost mundane nature of the encounter has led some historians to wonder if Homer was working from older source material, perhaps accounts from real Greek sailors who'd had confrontations in distant lands with people or things they couldn't explain. But here's where things get complicated. Archaeological discoveries in the Mediterranean have revealed something that ancient Greeks would have encountered with shocking regularity: dwarf elephant skulls. These prehistoric creatures once lived on several Mediterranean islands, including Sicily and Cyprus, and their skulls possess a feature that would have seemed impossibly strange to anyone unfamiliar with elephant anatomy. The large nasal cavity in the center of the skull, where the trunk attached in life, looks remarkably like a single giant eye socket, positioned exactly in the middle of the forehead. To a Greek sailor stumbling across these massive skulls in a cave, the resemblance to a one-eyed giant would have been immediate and terrifying. The dwarf elephant theory has gained considerable support among paleontologists and classical scholars. It explains not just the physical description of the Cyclops, but also why these encounters were so often associated with caves and islands. Dwarf elephants lived on isolated Mediterranean islands, where they evolved smaller bodies due to limited resources. a phenomenon scientists call insular dwarfism. When these animals died, their bones would accumulate in caves, exactly the kinds of places where Greek explorers might seek shelter during storms or look for fresh water. Discovering a skull the size of a large boulder with what appeared to be a single central eye socket would create an immediate and powerful impression. The Greeks, having no context for elephants, which didn't exist in their homeland, would naturally interpret what they saw through the lens of their understanding. A giant, a monster, a Cyclops. Yet this explanation, as compelling as it seems, doesn't account for everything, because the ancient Greeks didn't just find bones. They claimed to see living Cyclops. Multiple accounts exist from Greek explorers, geographers, Xian historians describing encounters with one-eyed beings in distant lands. These weren't all retellings of Homer, they were independent reports separated by centuries and thousands of miles, describing similar beings in different parts of the ancient world. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, mentions the Arimaspi, a tribe of one-eyed people said to live in the far north beyond Scythia. He wasn't alone in this claim. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 500 years earlier, also referenced these one-eyed northern people, describing them as being in constant warfare with griffins over gold deposits. Ctesias, a Greek physician who worked at the Persian court around 400 BCE, wrote about one-eyed people living in India. His accounts were dismissed by many of his contemporaries as exaggerations or outright fabrications, but Ctesias insisted he was reporting what he'd learned from reliable sources during his years in Persia, an empire whose trade networks extended far into Asia. The consistency of these reports across different time periods and geographical regions creates a puzzle. Either multiple independent cultures were all inventing the same mythological being, or Greek and Roman explorers were encountering something in the real world that they interpreted as Cyclopes. The question is what? Modern medicine offers another possible explanation that most people never consider. Cyclopia is a rare birth defect in which the two eye orbits fail to separate during fetal development, resulting in a single eye or partially fused eyes in the center of the forehead. It occurs in roughly 1 in every 100,000 births in humans, and affected infants rarely survive more than a few hours or days due to associated brain abnormalities. However, in ancient times, when medical knowledge was limited and infant mortality rates were astronomically high compared to today, a child born with such a condition who somehow survived might have been hidden away, feared, or even venerated depending on the culture. Greek explorers encountering isolated communities with different cultural practices might have seen individuals with this condition and carried those stories home, where they merged with existing legends and older accounts. But there's a problem with relying too heavily on medical explanations. Cyclopia, while it produces the single eye characteristic, doesn't create giants. The descriptions that come down to us from ancient sources consistently describe Cyclopes as being larger than normal humans, often significantly so. If Greek sailors were simply seeing people with birth defects, why would they all describe them as giants? The answer might lie in the psychology of fear and memory. When humans encounter something that frightens them, their memories of the event tend to become distorted over time. Threatening figures appear larger in recollection. Unusual features become exaggerated. A person of normal height with a shocking facial abnormality seen briefly in dim light or from a distance might be remembered and reported as a towering monster. This phenomenon is well documented in modern psychology, and there's no reason to think ancient peoples were immune to it. Meanwhile, another thread of this mystery winds through the volcanic landscapes of Sicily itself. The island's geography plays a crucial role in understanding why Cyclops legends became so strongly associated with this particular location. Sicily sits atop intense volcanic and seismic activity. Mount Etna, one of the world's most active volcanoes, dominates the eastern part of the island and has been erupting regularly for hundreds of thousands of years. The ancient Greeks, settling in Sicily starting around the 8th century before the Common Era, would have witnessed Etna's eruptions firsthand. They would have seen the mountain belch fire and smoke, heard it roar, watched it hurl massive boulders kilometers into the air. In their understanding of the world, such displays of raw power required an explanation that fit their cosmological framework. The Greeks came to believe that Cyclops worked as blacksmiths for Hephaestus, the god of fire and metalworking, in forges located beneath volcanic mountains. The sounds of eruptions became, in their interpretation, the sounds of giant hammers striking anvils. The glow from volcanic vents became the light from divine forges. The sulfurous smell that accompanies volcanic activity became the stench of the Cyclops themselves. This wasn't primitive thinking or simple-minded superstition. It was a sophisticated attempt to create a coherent explanation for dramatic natural phenomena using the intellectual tools available at the time. However, the fact that the Greeks created mythological explanations for volcanoes doesn't mean they weren't also encountering something real that they called Cyclopes. The ancient Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, provides a fascinating account that blurs the line between natural observation and creature report. He describes regions in Sicily where enormous bones had been discovered, bones that locals attributed to Cyclops. Strabo himself was skeptical of the Cyclops interpretation, but he doesn't dismiss the bones as fictional. He acknowledges they existed and were genuinely enormous, but he couldn't offer an alternative explanation that satisfied him. Modern archaeologists now know these were likely the remains of dwarf elephants or other prehistoric megafauna. But Strabo's account reveals something important. Even in the ancient world, not everyone automatically accepted the Cyclops explanation. There was debate, skepticism, investigation. Yet the bones remained, undeniable and unexplained by the science of the time. What's particularly intriguing is how the Cyclops myth evolved differently in different regions where Greeks settled. In Sicily, Cyclopes were primarily associated with Etna and depicted as savage shepherds or skilled blacksmiths. In other areas of the Mediterranean, one-eyed giants took on different characteristics. Some were portrayed as builders of megalithic structures. When ancient Greeks encountered massive stone walls or monuments they couldn't imagine contemporary humans constructing, they often attributed these structures to Cyclopes. The term Cyclopean masonry still exists in archaeology to describe walls built from massive, irregular limestone boulders fitted together without mortar. The Greeks assumed only giants could have moved such stones. Modern archaeology has shown that humans using levers, ramps, and persistence could indeed build these structures, but the Greek attribution to Cyclops reveals an important pattern. Wherever they found things they couldn't explain, they reached for the Cyclops narrative. This pattern raises a crucial question. Were Cyclops a catch-all explanation for anything mysterious? Or were there genuine encounters that spawned the legend in the first place, which then became the default explanation for other puzzling discoveries? The answer might be both. Legendary creatures often begin with a kernel of truth, some real encounter or discovery, which then becomes elaborated through retelling until the original event is buried under layers of mythological embellishment. Separating that original kernel from the later additions becomes nearly impossible, especially when the only records we have were written centuries or even millennia after the supposed events. Consider the voyage of Odysseus as Homer describes it. The journey takes him past locations that can be identified with real places in the Mediterranean, mixed with locations that are clearly mythological or impossible to pin down geographically. Sicily is mentioned. The Straits of Messina are almost certainly the location of Scylla and Charybdis, but the island of the Cyclops is described as uninhabited by humans, a place where wild grapes grow without cultivation, and where the harbors are so perfect that ships need no anchor. Some scholars have tried to identify this with various Mediterranean islands. Others argue it's purely imaginary. However, the mixture of real and mythological geography in the Odyssey might reflect how ancient mariners actually experienced their voyages. Real islands and real dangers interspersed with stories, exaggerations, and genuine mysteries they encountered along the way. The Greeks weren't the only ancient culture with one-eyed giant legends. Similar beings appear in the mythologies of cultures around the world, from the British Isles to India to the Americas. This global distribution has led some researchers to suggest that the Cyclops archetype taps into something universal in human psychology. Perhaps a deep-seated fear of predatory beings, or a manifestation of the uncanny valley effect when we encounter something almost human but disturbingly different. Others point to the worldwide distribution of elephant and mammoth remains as a simpler explanation. Everywhere ancient peoples encountered these massive skulls with their central nasal cavities, they seem to have interpreted them as the remains of one-eyed giants. The consistency of this misinterpretation across cultures suggests it's a very natural human response to elephant skull morphology. But let's return to those Greek sailors off the coast of Sicily, because there's an aspect of their accounts that the elephant skull theory doesn't fully address. Many of the ancient reports don't just mention finding bones or skulls, they describe seeing living cyclops. They describe interactions, conflicts, narrow escapes. In the Odyssey, Polyphemus speaks. He has a name. He has relationships with other Cyclopes. He knows his father Poseidon will avenge his blinding. This isn't a description of finding mysterious bones. This is a narrative of encounter with a living, intelligent being. Even if we dismiss Homer as fiction, other ancient accounts exist that claim direct sightings of one-eyed beings, and not all of them can be explained away as misidentified animals or people with birth defects. The historian Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, recounts a story he heard about the finding of a massive skeleton in Asia Minor. The bones were so large that locals believed they belonged to a giant from the Age of Heroes. Pausanias himself was skeptical but curious. He notes that the proportions seem wrong for a normal human, even accounting for exaggeration in the retelling. What's fascinating is his scientific approach. Rather than automatically accepting or rejecting the giant explanation, he tries to investigate, to gather details, to make sense of anomalous evidence. His account reveals that ancient peoples weren't all credulous believers in monsters. Many approached strange discoveries with genuine curiosity and attempted to apply reason. Yet even with that reasoned approach, they often reached the conclusion that they were dealing with something outside normal human experience. The challenge we face in examining these ancient accounts is separating honest mistakes and misidentifications from actual deception, from the small possibility that something genuinely unusual was encountered. Human beings are remarkably good at convincing ourselves we saw what we expected to see. If Greek sailors expected to encounter Cyclopes in certain regions because Homer had written about them, then when they saw something ambiguous, a large person in dim light, an unusual skull, a volcanic eruption, their brains would fill in the gaps to match the expected pattern. This is called confirmation bias, and it affects how we process information, even today. With all our modern scientific knowledge, ancient peoples, working with different frameworks for understanding the world, would have been even more susceptible to these cognitive shortcuts. Yet, there are accounts that resist easy explanation. The Aramaspi, those one-eyed people of the far north mentioned by multiple ancient sources, present a particular puzzle. The Greeks didn't have extensive contact with northern regions beyond Scythia. which corresponds roughly to the area north of the Black Sea. Information about more distant lands would have come through trade networks and intermediaries, creating a game of cultural telephone where details could easily become garbled. However, the Arimaspi legends include specific details about their warfare, with griffins over gold, details that show up in ancient art and seem to have been taken seriously by people at the time. Some modern scholars have suggested the griffin legends might have originated from nomadic peoples in Central Asia encountering Protoceratops fossils, dinosaur remains that could be interpreted as the bones of beaked, four-legged creatures. If that theory holds, then perhaps the one-eyed people fighting the griffins were simply nomadic groups in the same region, and the single eye was added to make them seem as exotic as the griffins they supposedly battled. This brings us to a fundamental question about ancient testimony. How much should we trust what ancient peoples claim to have seen? Modern archaeology has vindicated many ancient accounts that were once dismissed as pure fantasy. The city of Troy was considered mythological until Heinrich Schliemann excavated it in the 1870s. The Antikythera mechanism, an incredibly sophisticated ancient Greek astronomical calculator, seemed too advanced to be real until it was recovered from a shipwreck. Ancient descriptions of phenomena we didn't understand, from ball lightning to tsunamis, have been confirmed by modern science. So, when ancient Greeks consistently reported encountering one-eyed giants across multiple centuries and multiple sources, shouldn't we at least consider the possibility that they saw something real, even if it wasn't literally what they thought it was? The answer might lie in understanding how ancient peoples processed and transmitted information. In a world without photography, without scientific taxonomy, without modern medical knowledge, when you encountered something unusual, you described it using the conceptual vocabulary available to you. If you found a massive skull with a central hole, you didn't think dwarf elephant because you didn't know elephants existed. You thought giant, and the single hole suggested single eye. And Cyclops was the term your culture used for such beings. If you met a person with a severe facial abnormality in a foreign land, you didn't think rare genetic condition. You thought monster or cursed being, or divine punishment. The reporting wasn't dishonest. It was simply filtered through a different framework of understanding. Archaeological evidence from Greek colonies in Sicily reveals that the early settlers there maintained regular contact with the indigenous peoples of the island. These interactions weren't always peaceful, and conflicts would have been common as Greeks expanded their territorial claims. It's entirely possible that some Cyclops stories originated from hostile encounters with local populations, encounters that got embellished in the retelling. A Greek trader or explorer attacked by tribesmen while sheltering in a cave might return home with tales of savage cave-dwelling giants. The fear and adrenaline of combat, combined with unfamiliarity with local peoples and the natural human tendency to demonize enemies, could transform a group of defending locals into mythological monsters in the space of a single frightened night and subsequent traumatized voyage home. But then there's the matter of the Cyclops, who were portrayed not as monsters but as craftsmen. In Hesiod's Theogony, written around the same time as Homer's Odyssey, or perhaps even earlier, Cyclops are described as the forgers of Zeus's thunderbolts. They're skilled metalworkers, gifted artisans who create weapons of divine power. This portrayal stands in stark contrast to the savage shepherd Polyphemus of the Odyssey. What accounts for such different characterizations of the same beings within Greek mythology? One possibility is that the Greeks encountered two different phenomena that they both labeled as Cyclops. The bones and skulls found in caves became associated with savage monsters. The mysterious origins of advanced metalworking techniques, perhaps imported from other cultures or discovered in ancient ruins, became attributed to gifted giant craftsmen. Both were cyclopes. but they served different narrative and explanatory functions. The connection between Cyclopes and blacksmithing deserves deeper examination because it reveals something important about how the Greeks understood technology and craftsmanship. Metalworking, especially bronze working and later ironworking, was seen as almost magical by ancient peoples. The transformation of dull rocks into gleaming weapons and tools through the application of fire and skill seemed to require supernatural ability. Smiths in many ancient cultures occupied ambiguous social positions, respected for their skills, but also feared and sometimes isolated because of the mysterious nature of their craft. If Greek traders encountered a technologically advanced culture with superior metalworking techniques that seemed impossible to replicate, attributing those abilities to giants or to beings who weren't quite human would make sense within their worldview. The Cyclopes became a way to explain technological gaps between cultures. This pattern appears repeatedly in how ancient Greeks interpreted the world around them. Anything that exceeded their current capabilities must have required supernatural or superhuman agency. Massive stone structures built by Cyclops, superior weapons forged by Cyclops, volcanic eruptions, the Cyclops at work in their underground forges. It was a coherent system of understanding that explained observed reality, just not in terms we would accept today. However, coherent wrong explanations can still contain valuable information. They tell us what ancient peoples actually encountered, even if their interpretation of those encounters was incorrect. Modern genetic research has revealed something else worth considering. Archaeological studies of ancient remains from around the Mediterranean show that populations in antiquity were more diverse than once believed. Gene flow between distant regions happened more readily than historians previously thought. Trade networks connected the Mediterranean world to Africa, to Central Asia, to the Indian subcontinent. It's entirely possible that Greek explorers encountered peoples with physical characteristics unusual to them, characteristics they struggled to describe accurately. There are genetic conditions that affect cranial formation, creating unusual bone structures around the eyes and forehead. There are populations adapted to specific environments who might have appeared very different from the Greeks who encountered them. Some of these differences might have been exaggerated in retelling until they became the monstrous descriptions we find in ancient texts. What we're seeing, when we examine all these threads together, is not a simple case of Greeks making up stories or stupidly mistaking elephant skulls for monsters. We're seeing a complex intersection of real discoveries, genuine encounters with unfamiliar peoples and places, misidentification of prehistoric remains, psychological factors affecting memory and testimony, and cultural frameworks that demanded explanations for the strange and unknown. The Cyclops legends represent all of these factors woven together over centuries into a mythology that felt true because it was built on fragments of truth, even though the overall picture was fantastical. And here's what makes the ancient accounts so compelling even today. The Greeks kept encountering evidence that reinforced their belief in Cyclops. Every new cave explored might contain more massive bones. Every voyage to unknown waters might bring contact with unusual peoples. Every volcanic eruption proved that the forges were still active. The myth was self-reinforcing because the Mediterranean world kept providing ambiguous evidence that could be interpreted as supporting it. In the absence of alternative scientific explanations, the Cyclops narrative worked. It explained the data as the Greeks understood it. It provided a framework for processing strange discoveries. It warned sailors about dangerous regions and prepared colonists for what they might encounter in distant lands. The question of whether Cyclopes were real misses the more important point about how knowledge was constructed and transmitted in the ancient world. The Greeks were rational people working with the information available to them. when their best thinkers and most experienced travelers consistently reported one-eyed giants in certain regions, that became accepted knowledge, not because the Greeks were gullible, but because the evidence as they interpreted it supported the claim. We do the same thing today. We accept scientific findings based on expert testimony and evidence we mostly can't verify ourselves. The difference is our framework for interpretation has changed. Our methods of investigation have improved, and our store of comparative knowledge has expanded enormously. But the fundamental process of trying to make sense of strange evidence through the lens of available understanding is identical. This is why the Cyclops legends deserve serious study rather than dismissal as primitive superstition. They represent early human attempts at archaeology, anthropology, and natural history. The Greeks found giant bones and tried to reconstruct what creatures they came from. They encountered unusual peoples and tried to catalog human diversity. They observed volcanic activity and tried to explain geological processes. Their conclusions were often wrong by modern standards, but their methodology of observation, documentation, and interpretation was sound. They were doing science with the tools they had. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, includes extensive discussions of various unusual peoples and creatures reported from distant lands. He's often skeptical, frequently noting when he finds a report hard to believe. Yet he includes the information anyway, because it came from sources he considered reliable. What's striking is that Pliny treats this information the same way he treats reports of unusual animals or plants. He's cataloging the diversity of the natural world as it's been reported to him, maintaining scholarly distance while presenting the evidence. Yet, some Greek explorers did return to locations where Cyclopes had been reported. Sicily was colonized extensively by Greeks, starting in the 8th century before the Common Era, with major cities like Syracuse becoming important centers of Greek culture. These colonists lived for generations in the very regions where Cyclops sightings had been reported. If the Cyclopes were purely mythological, you'd expect the legends to fade as Greeks became familiar with Sicily's actual geography and inhabitants. Instead, the legends persisted and even flourished. The Greeks integrated Cyclops mythology into Sicilian identity, pointing to specific caves as Cyclops dwellings and specific regions as places where the giants still lurked. This persistence suggests the colonists kept finding things that reinforced the mythology. More elephant skulls, more caves with massive bones, more volcanic activity that seemed to confirm the underground forges. The evidence kept accumulating in ways that fit the existing narrative. There's another layer to this that researchers have only recently begun to explore seriously: the role of local populations in shaping Greek Cyclops legends. When Greeks arrived in Sicily and other colonial territories, they encountered indigenous peoples with their own mythologies and monster stories. Some scholars now believe that Greek Cyclops legends absorbed and merged with local traditions about giants or supernatural beings. The Greeks might have heard Sicilian stories about giant cave dwellers and combined them with their own developing Cyclops mythology, creating a hybrid tradition that drew from multiple cultural sources. The volcanic activity of the Mediterranean provides another thread worth following. Beyond Sicily's Mount Etna, the region included numerous active volcanoes. Volcanic regions often have caves formed by lava tubes, exactly the kinds of sheltered spaces where ancient peoples would seek refuge and where bones of dead animals would accumulate. The combination of volcanic activity, caves, and prehistoric megafauna remains created perfect conditions for Cyclops legends to develop and spread. Each element reinforced the others. The caves explained where Cyclops lived. The bones proved giants existed. The volcanic activity demonstrated the forges were real. Understanding this framework helps explain why smart, educated ancient Greeks continued believing in Cyclopes even as their civilization advanced and their knowledge expanded in other areas. The evidence they had access to genuinely seemed to support the conclusion. They weren't ignoring contradictory evidence. From their perspective, there wasn't any. Every investigation turned up more confirmation. More bones, more caves, more volcanic forges. The Cyclops weren't a failure of Greek rationality. They were a rational conclusion based on incomplete information and a different interpretive framework. And what happened next would only deepen the mystery further. The mystery deepened in ways the ancient Greeks could never have anticipated, because as their world expanded through conquest and trade, the reports of Cyclops didn't decrease, they multiplied. Alexander the Great's campaigns into Asia in the 4th century before the Common Era brought Greek explorers into contact with lands and peoples that had been little more than rumors. When Alexander's armies pushed into what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, the soldiers returned with stories that echoed the old legends but added disturbing new details. They spoke of encountering one-eyed warriors in mountain passes, beings who fought with savage intelligence and seemed to possess knowledge of metallurgy that surpassed even Greek craftsmanship. These weren't the isolated reports of frightened sailors anymore. These were accounts from battle-hardened veterans of one of history's most successful military campaigns, men who had faced war elephants and survived sieges, who had no reason to invent monster stories. Their officers documented these encounters in campaign journals, some of which survived into later centuries, to be quoted by historians like Arrian and Plutarch. The accounts describe beings who used advanced weapons, who communicated in unknown languages, who lived in fortified settlements high in mountain regions where Greek armies rarely ventured. One particularly detailed account from a cavalry commander named Nearchus describes his patrol encountering what he called a tribe of single-eyed giants in the Hindu Kush mountains. According to his report, these beings stood taller than any men he'd seen, wore armor made from a bronze alloy his smiths couldn't identify, and retreated into mountain fortresses when approached. They didn't attack, but they made it clear through gestures and warning shouts that the Greeks were not welcome in their territory. Nearchus's account is remarkable for what it doesn't include. He doesn't claim these beings were monsters or supernatural. He describes them as people, unusual people certainly, but clearly intelligent and organized. They had settlements, they had weapons, they had territory they defended. This measured, almost clinical description from a military officer makes the account harder to dismiss than more sensational stories. Nearchus was trying to report what he saw, and what he saw were very tall people with unusual facial features living in remote mountains. Whether they actually had single eyes, or whether that's how Nearchus interpreted what he saw from a distance remains an open question, but something was there. Something real enough that a Greek cavalry officer felt compelled to document the encounter in his official reports. The geographic expansion of Cyclops reports forces us to reconsider the elephant skull theory. While dwarf elephant remains explained Sicilian and Cypriot legends beautifully, they don't account for sightings in Central Asia or Northern India, regions where elephant species were known and wouldn't have been misidentified. The air maspi of the far north present a similar problem. These one-eyed people were consistently described as human in most respects, except for their single central eye, and they were placed in regions where elephant remains wouldn't explain the reports. Either the Cyclops concept had become so embedded in Greek thought that explorers were seeing Cyclopes everywhere, regardless of actual evidence, or something else was generating these consistent reports across wildly different geographical regions. One possibility that scholars have begun examining more seriously involves the cultural practice of deliberate cranial modification. Various ancient cultures around the world practiced intentional skull shaping, binding infants' heads to create elongated or flattened cranial shapes that marked social status or tribal identity. Some of these modifications, particularly those that affected the orbital regions around the eyes, could create unusual facial appearances that might have been interpreted by Greek observers as having a single eye or merged eyes. If Greek explorers encountered populations practicing such modifications, especially in dim lighting or from a distance, they might have reported seeing one-eyed people. This would explain why the Cyclops reports often describe otherwise normal human behavior and intelligence. These weren't monsters. They were simply people whose appearance had been altered by cultural practices the Greeks didn't understand. However, cranial modification doesn't typically affect the eyes themselves, only the surrounding bone structure. For Greeks to perceive someone as having a single eye would require more than an unusual skull shape. It would require either severe misperception, deliberate cultural practices that affected eye appearance through cosmetics or masks, or genuine biological anomalies. This brings us back to cyclopia and related congenital conditions, but with a twist. What if certain isolated populations had higher than normal rates of these conditions due to genetic bottlenecks? Small population groups with limited genetic diversity sometimes show elevated rates of specific birth defects. If Greek explorers encountered such populations, they might have seen multiple individuals with eye abnormalities, leading them to conclude they'd found a tribe or race of one-eyed people rather than recognizing these as individual birth defects. The question of size remains problematic for all these explanations. Greek accounts consistently describe Cyclops as giants. And while fear and memory distortion can exaggerate height, the consistency of this detail across hundreds of years of reports suggests something more than psychological factors at work. One intriguing possibility comes from recent discoveries in ancient genetics. We now know that gigantism, caused by growth hormone disorders, occurred in ancient populations. Skeletal remains of individuals who stood 7 feet tall or more have been found in archaeological contexts throughout the Mediterranean and Asia. In most modern populations, such individuals are rare enough to be remarkable. In ancient populations with different genetic compositions and environmental factors, the frequency might have been different. If Greek explorers encountered a population where gigantism occurred more frequently than in their own society, and if some of those giants also had eye abnormalities, the combination would have seemed like confirmation of Cyclops legends. This genetic explanation gained support from an unexpected source. Modern medical studies of isolated populations have revealed that certain genetic conditions tend to cluster geographically. In some regions, particular birth defects or unusual physical traits appear at rates far higher than the global average due to founder effects and genetic drift. If ancient Mediterranean islands or remote mountain valleys harbored populations with elevated rates of both growth disorders and eye abnormalities, Greek explorers encountering these groups would have seen exactly what they expected to see: cyclopes, giants with single eyes. The legend would have been confirmed by observable reality, even though the underlying explanation was genetics rather than mythology. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn, because in 1857, a French archaeological expedition in Algeria uncovered something that reignited scholarly debate about the historical reality of Cyclops. In a cave system south of Constantine, excavators found massive stone tools, unlike anything in the known archaeological record of the region. The tools were roughly worked, clearly designed for hands much larger than normal humans possess, and they were associated with bone deposits that included both animal remains and what appeared to be processed food waste. The excavation report, published in 1859, carefully avoided claiming to have found evidence of giants, but the implications were clear. Someone or something considerably larger than normal humans had lived in these caves and had possessed the intelligence to create tools and process food. The French findings were controversial from the start. Critics pointed out that the tools could have been ceremonial objects, or that their size had been exaggerated in the reports. The bone deposits could have been from animals entirely. The excavators themselves admitted they'd found no skeletal remains that definitively proved the existence of giant humanoids. Yet the tools remained, physically real and inexplicable by the archaeological theories of the time. Some researchers suggested they might have been created by a now extinct species of large primate, something like a Mediterranean equivalent to the Asian orangutan. Others maintained they were simply oversized human tools, created for specific purposes we no longer understand. The debate simmered in academic journals for decades, never quite resolved. Then, in the 1920s, Greek archaeologists working in Crete made a discovery that seemed to validate some aspects of ancient Cyclops accounts. Excavating a Minoan palace complex, they uncovered a chamber that had been deliberately sealed in antiquity. Inside were the remains of what appeared to be a specialized forge, complete with bronze working tools and partially finished weapons. But what captured attention was the scale. The forge was built for someone considerably larger than average, with a raised working surface and tools sized for hands that would dwarf normal human proportions. The excavators noted that Minoan civilization had extensive contact with early Greek cultures, and that the timing suggested this forge had been in use during the period when the earliest Cyclops legends were forming. The Cretan forge raised fascinating questions. Had the Minoans employed unusually large craftsmen, perhaps individuals with gigantism, who were valued for their size and strength? Did ancient Mediterranean cultures sometimes organize specialized labor around individuals with unusual physical characteristics? If a Bronze Age civilization had indeed employed giant smiths, that would explain both the Greek association of Cyclopes with metalworking and the legendary skill attributed to them. The forge builders would have been real people, exceptionally large individuals with real metallurgical expertise, who over time became mythologized into the supernatural Cyclops of Greek legend. Supporting this interpretation, historical records from various ancient cultures reference the practice of collecting individuals with unusual physical traits for specific purposes. Egyptian pharaohs kept dwarfs as valued members of their courts. Roman emperors collected people with gigantism as bodyguards and showpieces. Chinese emperors employed exceptionally tall individuals in ceremonial roles. If Mediterranean Bronze Age cultures similarly valued and employed giants, especially in physically demanding crafts like metalworking, the connection between real historical practices and Cyclops mythology becomes direct and traceable. The legends weren't invented from nothing. They were cultural memories of real people whose unusual size made them simultaneously valuable and frightening to their societies. This brings us to perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence linking Cyclops legends to historical reality. In 1973, paleontologists working in Sicily made an announcement that seemed to close the circle on the mystery. They'd been excavating a coastal cave system known locally as the Cave of Polyphemus, named for its legendary association with the Cyclops from the Odyssey. What they found inside wasn't just dwarf elephant remains. They found evidence of human habitation, overlapping with the elephant bone deposits. Ancient peoples had lived in this cave, had used it as shelter, had built fires there, and had definitely encountered the massive skulls of the extinct elephants. The paleontologists could demonstrate a direct historical connection between human inhabitants and elephant remains in precisely the location where Greek legend placed a Cyclops. The excavation revealed multiple occupation layers spanning thousands of years. The earliest human activity in the cave dated back to the Neolithic period, long before Greek colonization of Sicily. These early inhabitants would have found elephant bones already present in the cave, weathered and ancient even then. Carbon dating of charcoal from their fire pits placed them in contact with the remains around 6,000 years ago. This was crucial because it meant elephant skull discoveries predated Greek arrival in Sicily by millennia. The seeds of giant mythology might have been planted by indigenous Sicilian peoples long before the first Greek ship ever approached the island's shores. When Greeks arrived and heard local stories about cave-dwelling giants, they weren't inventing the legend. They were absorbing and adapting existing indigenous traditions. The paleontologists also found something fascinating in the arrangement of the elephant bones. Some of the skulls had been moved from where the animals originally died. They'd been deliberately positioned near the cave entrance, almost as if on display. Someone, at some point in the cave's long history of human use, had recognized these skulls as significant objects and had arranged them intentionally. Whether this was done to frighten away intruders, to mark the cave as a special place, or to create a kind of shrine to the mysterious giants the bones represented, we can't know. But the deliberate arrangement proves that ancient peoples didn't just stumble across these remains and forget about them. They engaged with the skulls as meaningful objects, integrating them into their understanding of the landscape and perhaps into their spiritual practices. Moreover, the excavation revealed something unexpected. Mixed in with the elephant bones were skeletal remains of an unusually large human individual, someone who in life would have stood close to 7 feet tall. The bones dated to roughly the 8th century before the Common Era, almost exactly the time when Homer was composing the Odyssey. The individual showed signs of a pituitary disorder that would have caused gigantism, and the skull, while damaged, showed evidence of an unusual brow ridge formation that might have created a distinctive facial appearance. The cave had been home to someone who combined several key Cyclops characteristics: exceptional size, an unusual skull structure, and association with a location where massive single-eye socket skulls were readily visible. The Sicilian cave dweller might represent the kernel of truth around which the Polyphemus legend crystallized. A real person, a giant who lived alone in a cave filled with mysterious skulls, encountered by Greek sailors or early colonists who then carried the story home. Over generations of retelling, the unusual but human resident became a monster. His size was exaggerated further. His distinctive facial features became a single central eye. His solitary lifestyle became savage cannibalism. The elephant skulls in his cave became his own kind. The legend built on itself until the original encounter was buried under layers of mythological elaboration. Yet even this compelling explanation doesn't account for all the ancient reports, because while one giant in one Sicilian cave might explain Polyphemus, it doesn't explain the Arimaspi in the far north, the one-eyed warriors Alexander's soldiers encountered in Asia, or the consistent reports of one-eyed beings from multiple sources across centuries. Either the same combination of factors, real giants living in caves with misidentified elephant skulls, occurred independently in multiple locations, or the power of the Cyclops narrative was so strong that it shaped how Greeks interpreted any unusual encounter with large individuals or strange skeletal remains. Anthropologists studying myth formation have documented this pattern repeatedly. Once a powerful narrative takes hold in a culture, it becomes a lens through which ambiguous evidence is interpreted. The Cyclops concept, once established through the combination of elephant skull discoveries and encounters with giants or people with facial abnormalities, became the default explanation the Greeks reached for when encountering anything that seemed to fit the pattern. A large skull with a central cavity? Cyclops. An unusually tall person in a remote region? Cyclops. Strange metalworking techniques that seemed too advanced? Must have been made by Cyclops smiths. The mythology became self-fulfilling, shaping observation and interpretation in ways that continually reinforced itself. Modern psychology recognizes this as a form of confirmation bias combined with cultural priming. When you expect to find something, you're far more likely to interpret ambiguous evidence as confirming your expectation. The ancient Greeks expected to find Cyclops in distant lands because their literature, their travelers' tales, and their cultural framework all told them Cyclops existed when they encountered anything that could possibly be interpreted as Cyclops related. That's how they interpreted it. This doesn't mean they were stupid or primitive. It means they were human, subject to the same cognitive patterns that affect all of us. We see what we expect to see. We find patterns that confirm our beliefs. The Greeks were no different. But there's a final twist to this story that brings it full circle to where we began. In 2012, marine archaeologists exploring a shipwreck off the coast of Antikythera, the same site where the famous Antikythera mechanism was discovered, found something strange in the cargo hold. Among the amphorae and bronze statues being transported from the eastern Mediterranean to Rome, they discovered several carefully wrapped packages containing what appeared to be animal skulls. When these skulls were analyzed, they proved to be dwarf elephant remains from Cyprus or Crete, being deliberately transported as valuable cargo. Someone in the ancient world was collecting these skulls. Someone thought they were valuable enough to ship across the Mediterranean. The discovery raises intriguing questions. Were these being transported as curiosities, as religious relics, as proof of Cyclops' existence? We may never know the intended destination or purpose, but the fact that someone valued these skulls enough to ship them as cargo tells us that ancient peoples recognized their unusual nature. Perhaps merchants sold Cyclops skulls to wealthy collectors. Perhaps they were displayed in temples or used in religious ceremonies. Perhaps natural philosophers collected them to study the remains of legendary creatures. Whatever the purpose, the Antikythera cargo demonstrates that the connection between elephant skulls and Cyclops legends was real and recognized in the ancient world. The Greeks weren't just accidentally stumbling across these remains and misidentifying them. They were actively engaging with them as cultural objects related to their mythology. This transforms our understanding of the relationship between myth and evidence in Greek culture. The Greeks weren't passive victims of their own misunderstanding. They were actively investigating, collecting, transporting, and displaying the physical evidence they believed confirmed their legendary narratives. In a sense, they were conducting their own form of cryptozoology, attempting to prove through physical remains that the creatures of their mythology were real. The methodology was different from modern science, but the impulse was the same. Find evidence, examine it, use it to support or challenge existing beliefs about the world. So what's the final answer to the mystery of the Cyclops? Like most interesting historical questions, there isn't a single simple explanation. The Cyclops legends of ancient Greece appear to have been built from multiple sources. Dwarf elephant skulls found in Mediterranean caves provided the distinctive single central eye socket that became the defining Cyclops characteristic. Real individuals with gigantism, valued for their size, and employed in physically demanding crafts like metalworking, contributed the giant craftsman tradition. Rare cases of cyclopia and other facial abnormalities, when encountered in isolated populations, reinforced the belief that one-eyed beings existed. Volcanic activity and the caves it created provided the atmospheric setting and the legendary underground forges. Cultural practices like cranial modification, when observed in unfamiliar populations, added to reports of strangely formed beings in distant lands. Each of these elements alone might have created a minor legend or a passing curiosity. Together, they wove into a mythology so powerful and so seemingly well supported by observable evidence that it persisted for over 1,000 years and influenced how Greeks interpreted their entire world. The Cyclops weren't real in the sense of being actual one-eyed giants, but they weren't purely fictional either. They were a cultural construct built on genuine discoveries, real encounters, and the very human need to explain the strange and unknown through narratives that made sense within existing worldviews. What makes the Cyclops story so valuable isn't just its entertainment value or its place in classical literature. It's what it reveals about how all human cultures, including our own, construct knowledge about the world. We observe phenomena we don't fully understand. We gather evidence that seems to support certain conclusions. We create narratives that explain what we've observed. We look for additional evidence that confirms our narratives. And we resist alternative explanations that challenge our established understanding. The ancient Greeks did this with Cyclopes. We do it today with countless other phenomena. The process is fundamentally the same. The difference is that we now have tools and methodologies that help us recognize when we're interpreting evidence through the lens of expectation rather than seeing it clearly. We have comparative anatomy that lets us identify elephant skulls correctly. We have genetics that explains congenital conditions. We have archaeology that can date and contextualize ancient remains. We have psychology that helps us understand how fear and expectation distort memory and perception. But even with all these tools, we're still susceptible to seeing patterns that aren't there and interpreting ambiguous evidence through our own cultural frameworks. We're still human, still pattern-seeking, still building narratives to explain our observations. The ancient Greek sailors who first carried Cyclops stories back to their home ports weren't lying when they described what they'd seen. They were reporting their genuine experiences as filtered through their understanding, their fears, and their cultural expectations. They'd found massive skulls with central eye sockets in dark caves. They'd encountered unusually large individuals in distant lands. They'd seen volcanic forges belching fire and smoke. They'd heard stories from indigenous peoples about giants and monsters. All of this was real. Their interpretation that these various observations proved the existence of one-eyed giants was wrong, but it was a rational wrong conclusion based on the information available to them. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Cyclops legends. Not that ancient peoples were primitive or foolish, but that they were fundamentally like us, curious, observant, trying to make sense of a complex and often baffling world using the intellectual tools at their disposal. They saw strange things and tried to explain them. They gathered evidence and tried to interpret it. They built theories and looked for confirmation. They were doing science, just not with our modern understanding of what science is and how it should be conducted. The Cyclops were their hypothesis to explain the data they'd collected. It was wrong, but it was genuine inquiry nonetheless. Today, we know that the massive skulls in Sicilian caves belonged to dwarf elephants, extinct for thousands of years before the first Greeks settled the island. We know that individuals with gigantism occurred in ancient populations and were sometimes valued for their size. We know that cyclopia, while rare and almost always fatal, does occur as a birth defect. We know that volcanic activity creates caves and shapes landscapes in ways that seem supernatural to ancient observers. We know all this, and we can explain the Cyclops legends as a confluence of these various natural phenomena misinterpreted through a mythological lens. But knowing the explanation doesn't diminish the power of the story or the genuine mystery that ancient peoples confronted when they encountered evidence they couldn't explain. The Cyclops remain one of the most enduring figures in classical mythology, precisely because they were never purely mythological. They were always anchored to observable reality, to physical evidence that demanded explanation, to encounters that genuinely happened even if the interpretation was fantastical. The Greeks swore they'd encountered Cyclopes because, in a very real sense, they had. They'd encountered elephants' skulls that looked like giant one-eyed beings. They'd met people whose size and appearance seemed superhuman. They'd explored volcanic landscapes that suggested divine forges. Their testimony was honest. Their conclusion was wrong, but understandably so, given their context and knowledge. And standing here on the other side of that vast expanse of time, with all our modern knowledge and scientific understanding, we can look back at those ancient Greek sailors with something more than condescension. We can see them as fellow humans engaged in the same struggle we face, the struggle to understand what we observe, the struggle to separate truth from misinterpretation, the struggle to know the difference between what we've actually seen and what our expectations told us we saw. They failed to correctly identify dwarf elephant skulls, but we fail in 1,000 different ways to correctly interpret the evidence around us, filtered as it always is through our own expectations and limitations. The mystery of the Cyclopes, then, isn't really about whether one-eyed giants once roamed the Mediterranean. It's about the nature of knowledge itself, about how cultures build understanding from observation, about the power of narrative to shape interpretation, and about the enduring human drive to explain the unknown. Those ancient Greek sailors peering into dark Sicilian caves, finding massive skulls with central cavities, genuinely believed they'd discovered evidence of monsters. They were wrong about what they'd found, but they were right that they'd found something strange and worth investigating. And in that sense, their testimony across the centuries still has something valuable to tell us, not about Cyclopes, but about ourselves. The volcanic cliffs of Sicily still stand where they did 3,000 years ago. The caves still hold their secrets, though we understand those secrets differently now. Tourists visit the cave of Polyphemus today, walking through chambers where ancient peoples once huddled around fires, staring at massive elephant skulls and trying to make sense of what they had found. Modern guides tell the story of how dwarf elephant remains were misidentified as Cyclops bones, and visitors nod knowingly, secure in their scientific understanding. But something is lost in that certainty, something the ancient Greeks understood intuitively, even if they couldn't articulate it in our terms. They understood that the world is stranger than we expect, that exploration means encountering things that challenge our understanding, that honest observation sometimes leads to wrong conclusions. The caves haven't changed. The bones are still there. What's changed is only our framework for interpreting what we find. And somewhere in the dark waters between then and now, between myth and reality, the memory of those ancient sailors persists. Men who saw something they couldn't explain and did their best to report it honestly. Men who found massive skulls with central eye sockets and logical concluded they'd discovered giants. Men who encountered people whose appearance shocked and frightened them, and tried to describe what they'd seen using the vocabulary their culture provided. Their Cyclopes weren't real in the literal sense we demand today, but their curiosity was real. Their courage in exploring unknown waters was real. Their attempts to make sense of what they observed were genuine exercises in early scientific thinking, flawed perhaps, but honest. The story of the Cyclops reminds us that knowledge is never final, that our current understanding is simply the best framework we have with the information available to us, that future generations will look back at our certainties with the same mixture of respect and correction that we now direct toward those ancient explorers. They swore they'd encountered giants with eyes in the centers of their foreheads, and in a very real sense, they had. They'd encountered evidence that pointed toward giants, evidence that made sense within their understanding of the world. They weren't wrong to trust what they saw. They were only limited by what they knew, as are we all, as we will always be. And that's not a failure. That's simply the human condition, the eternal struggle to understand what we observe, to separate reality from interpretation, to know the difference between what is and what we believe must be.